Greetings from Stanford University. I'm Bill Barnett, professor at the Stanford Graduate School of Business and the Stanford Doerr School of Sustainability. And I have with us here today Professor Joe Piotroski of the Stanford Graduate School of Business. And Joe just finished running a conference here at Stanford on sustainability reporting and control. Joe, thanks so much for joining us.
Well, Bill, it's my pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Well, what a big topic. Maybe you could start by talking about what do we mean by reporting and control when we're talking sustainability?
Well, Bill, that's actually a great question. It's a great starting point for our conversation. When we talk about sustainability, reporting, and control, what we're really doing is thinking about the role of accounting inside of organizations. When we think about accounting, what we're really thinking about are sort of two things. One, the ability to measure performance and ultimately use accounting systems to understand the performance of the company, understand its economic condition, and then ultimately use that information to understand how the firm is creating value, how it's impacting the organization's stakeholders, and the like. The control side is really about stewardship of the firm's resources, thinking through issues related to accountability, thinking through whether or not the company is making the appropriate decisions given its strategy and given its mission. And I think more broadly, it's about having those systems in place to ensure that the firm is benefiting all of the company's stakeholders.
Well, that's interesting, and I understand perfectly what you're saying. I'm thinking, though, maybe a lot of our listeners, like me, are wondering, it sounds like those two factors are both linked to financial performance. How does this connect to sustainability?
That's a great observation, Bill. Sustainability ultimately is about performance. I think as accountants, we tend to view sustainability maybe a little bit more broadly than, say, somebody coming out of environmental sciences. We tend to think about sustainability as existing along three dimensions. I think the first is, as an accountant, naturally, it's about financial performance. It's about, is the firm utilizing its resources to create economic value? But these days, sustainability is something broader than just maximizing wealth, maximizing shareholder value. It's really about how the firm interacts with the environment, more broadly, actually, about environmental stewardship. And it's also about how the firm creates value, social value, for its various stakeholders. Obviously, corporations have a social responsibility, and it's about how they fulfill that responsibility and the types of impact that their activities have on everybody that interacts with the organization, from customers and employees all the way to society at large.
I see. Well, I get you there, but isn't it the problem that a company might do well or might do badly with respect to its environmental or social impact, and that doesn't show up in the numbers? Oh,
it absolutely doesn't show in the numbers, but that's part of where accounting is trying to move. If we think about the future of financial reporting and the future of reporting in general, it's about creating reports that actually are more all-inclusive with respect to environmental impacts as well as social impacts. There's been a movement over the last, one could even argue over the last 50 years, to try to bring in these non-financial impacts and outcomes into the reporting process.
Oh, interesting.
Next year, the SEC will be mandating rules that require firms, for example, to provide information about their carbon impacts. That's a first for the U.S. Securities Exchanges Commission. Clearly, though, Europe has been ahead on that. A lot of the reporting is voluntary, but there are frameworks in place to talk about how firms' activities relate to carbon, scope 1, 2, and 3, as well as broader frameworks that are about more general environmental issues, as well as the firm's impact on stakeholders and stakeholder-type orientation.
Oh, interesting. Now, I know a lot of our listeners will be familiar with scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3, but maybe you could remind our listeners about those terms. And then also, it's intriguing to me, especially as we get to scope 3, that a firm in its accounting would be talking about its carbon footprint, define that broadly.
Yeah, so first, let's just recap exactly what we mean by Scope 1, 2, and 3. And then, to be honest, Bill, you may be in a better position to do this than I even. But Scope 1 emissions relate to those emissions that are created directly by the organization itself. So the firm, for example, may be a manufacturing company, and we're looking at all the emissions that are created through sort of the production process of the company. Scope 2, it relates to those emissions that are being created by sort of the sources of energy and sources of resources for the organization. And then Scope 3 relates to all of the emissions that are being created through the company's value chain in some sense. It's about all the emissions that are occurring through the supply chain, so starting all the way up perhaps from the extraction of raw materials all the way through manufacturing of components and subcomponents and distributing them and delivering them to this organization. And then, of course, there's all of the downstream emissions that could occur, even including the type of emissions that arise from the customers using the product.
That seems important because I can imagine companies could go ahead and outsource particularly carbon-intensive activity and then be able to wipe that off the carbon balance sheet.
Well, that's exactly right. And I think that's where right now the government, the regulators are trying to figure out exactly what type of information in the U.S. should be mandated and how it should be thought about through the financial reporting process. Clearly, there are frameworks out there that tend to take a much broader view, and so they try to provide analyses associated with scopes 1, 2, and 3. But there is an argument, to be said that if you're reporting on an organization, you just look within the boundaries of the organization. I think that's just a big tension in the financial reporting process at the moment.
Oh, that's interesting. Well, hey, let's dive into the conference itself. You had a couple of days, a number of different papers. You had scholars coming in from all over the world. What were the highlights?
Oh, Bill, we could talk for hours about this. Okay. I really do believe that the conference was.
And don't worry, listeners, we will not talk for hours.
Fair point. I do believe that the conference was really interesting in that, first and foremost, it wasn't just about carbon emissions. I do think a lot of conferences that focus on the topic of sustainability tend to take a very narrow view. And it's a very important view, obviously. But what we tried to do with our conference was to broaden that lens and to think a lot about the environment, of course. And then we had a couple sessions, though, thinking about the social side of organizations and issues associated with sort of corporate social responsibility. In terms of highlights, boy, let me just kind of tick off a few, and then we can dig deeper.
Sounds good. Sounds good.
I thought probably one of the most interesting parts of the session related to this idea of measurement. How do we actually think about a firm, and speaking about carbon emissions, like how do we actually think about keeping track of the type of carbon emissions that have been occurring for a firm? How do we measure that? How do we accrue that throughout the process? And so we had a professor here from Oxford University. His name is Karthik Ramana, and he and one of his collaborators at Harvard have created a new type of accounting for carbon emissions. It's a non-monetary based accounting. It's really about keeping track of sort of tons of CO2 that have been released, but it's about how do you track that through the production and life cycle of a product. So starting with extraction, how much carbon is eventually tied up in that end product when you as a consumer buy it. And so they're thinking about a measurement process that is very much akin to how we think about like value-added taxes, where you from the inception of the raw materials, you literally track how much carbon has been created, and you allocate that to the individual products, and then that allocation moves through the supply chain so that when a manufacturer eventually purchases its steel and its glass and its oil and whatnot, it already comes with sort of a carbon value. And that ends up on the producer's balance sheet, and it stays on the balance sheet until they sell it as inventory, and then it gets transferred to the end consumer. And the idea is both to think about a way of tracking the creation and distribution of carbon, and then to start thinking about what's the price that should be sort of associated with that to the end user. And that price could be monetary, it could also be in terms of utility, but it's trying to think about how do we know what products are carbon heavy and not, and is there a way then to create some kind of disciplining if you have a product that is carbon intensive? Does that force you to change your behavior, say in the supply chain, in order to lower that value from the perception of the customers?
That's interesting.
Yeah, it's sort of a very novel framework, and we spent a great deal of time talking about that. Obviously, that just relates to carbon emissions, but that, of course, is a topic on everybody's mind.
Joe, if I could just interject, as I hear you talk about this, I'm struck. you accountants are focusing on the act of measuring itself, as opposed to then putting incentives in place or anything. So, for example, maybe consumers will react to this number, or maybe regulators will react to this number. But if we don't have the measure, we can't take action.
Yeah, that's absolutely right, Bill. I mean, measurement is the first step to making decisions. You know, I have a framework that I actually teach in my MBA class that's called Measure, Analyze, and Decide. I call it the MAD framework.
And that's great.
And the idea is you can't really make decisions, right, until you perform analysis, and you can't perform analysis until you have data that reflects the underlying activities of the firm. And so to me, measurement is always the first step. But as you alluded to, right, the end result shouldn't just be measurement. It should be actionable. It should be data that we then analyze and then decide what kind of decisions need to be made. And it's going to be through the lens, as you mentioned, of various constituents. Part of the conference actually focused on that incentive bit. We had a really nice theory paper presented by a young professor from the University of Chicago. Her name is Amore Riggs-Cragen. And what she was trying to do was try to consider what are the mechanisms we should use to motivate sort of positive, she's framing it as ESG, but positive strategies with respect to the environment, with respect to diversity, with respect to social outcome. And there she was trying to trade off different paths, things like, do you create contracts that incentivize a type of behavior? Do you institute tax systems that penalize firms for engaging in certain behavior? Or do you allow disclosure to be a regulation? So if you make the information available, does the market sort of self-discipline and causes firms to change? And what she showed in that paper, and it's early work, but it's really, really interesting, obviously, was that all three mechanisms do have a role, right? They can play a role in trying to create the types of outcomes that I think we all aspire for. To me, the most interesting finding was, though, on the contract side, on the incentive side. She showed how if firms write contracts where the managers or the executives are rewarded for both financial performance but also social performance or environmental performance, that it'll actually elicit the behavior you want if the two are correlated, positively correlated. So that you need the social or the environmental incentive has to feed into the financial outcomes of the firm. And that actually creates a really strong set of incentives. The markets seem to like it. Investors seem to prefer that type of relationship.
I see.
And it's interesting because as an outsider, I don't do work in that particular space, but as an outsider, it struck me because in accounting, we have a framework that's called the triple bottom line. And the triple bottom line says that when you're evaluating performance, you should be trying to think about environmental, social, and financial performance together, collectively. Obviously, there's trade-offs among those dimensions. Those are going to be some of the challenges you face trying to implement. But a successful strategy is one where environmental and social activities serve as a way of creating competitive advantage that then creates the value for the firm. And so you're trying to put the social and the environmental piece as bedrock, right? And if you do that and you do it well, it differentiates you and ultimately allows for value creation. Her findings basically mirror that. Create incentives that motivate the managers to do what's right environmentally and socially. And if you do it in a way that's synergistic with value creation, the managers are all in on it. Otherwise, they're starting to trade off, and that becomes a problem. We don't want them trading off between the two. We want them pulling in the same direction. Yeah. I thought that was, it's intuitive when you hear it said, but it was a really nice piece of work in that respect.
That trade-off worries me, though, Joe. I can imagine for a lot of firms, I don't know how many, but I could imagine for a lot of firms, if there is a trade-off, then the better the company does with respect to, say, the attractiveness of its products on non-sustainability grounds, maybe the worse it would perform with respect to sustainability. Is there that kind of...
Well, that's the trade-off we're worried about, right? We're worried about the conflicting incentives that could be created. If you tell a manager you're going to get rewarded on one of these three dimensions, then obviously they're going to tilt perhaps towards the easiest one, which may be, brown type products, right? Something that's very profitable, easy to produce, but very, say, carbon intensive or very dirty in terms of pollution. And they'll do that at the expense of environmental. And what we're trying to do is we're trying to convince them that if you go towards environmentally friendly products and practices, that in and of itself could be a route towards having a competitive product in the marketplace, one that creates value. And it's really, in some sense, it's up to the organization, right, to think about what are their opportunities to wed value creation and sustainability.
Yeah,
and that's what we're trying to challenge. And that's, I think, what her paper was trying to challenge a manager to think about, is that give them the incentives to do both. And if the two are positively correlated, they become sort of self-reinforcing. We don't want them to make a choice between A or B. We want them to do both.
Yeah. No, I hear you on that. Other papers, other highlights you'd like to bring to the fore.
Oh, let's see. So I thought there was some really interesting work being done. And speaking of the topic of sort of social responsibility, we did have some interesting papers in the space of social impact, social responsibility, more of the sort of the S side of ESG.
Sure.
I thought what was interesting there was there was a paper presented by Hans Christensen, who's a professor at the University of Chicago, and it actually looked at the value of having diversity when you consider something like a financial audit. There's a lot of evidence that suggests that race and ethnicity can have an influence on the performance of audits, and in particular, what happens when the firm being audited and the auditor are from the same background. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of gains to having, for example, individuals from the same background working together, reduces communication friction. Sometimes there's a shared understanding. But what he actually found in his work was that bringing in an auditor from a different race actually led to more critical audits. Part of it may be the lack of understanding. Maybe they have to dig deeper, but that ultimately the firms that had sort of a mixed relationship ended up having fewer financial, like what we'd call financial reporting failures, less likely of a restatement, less likely to be to have a modified or to have some kind of like restatement or failure down the road.
I see.
With the idea being, at least the argument that he was putting forward is that maybe when you have these environments where you bring in what would seem like a friction, it actually really creates more due diligence.
I see. That's interesting. And those were from American.
Those were American. Yeah, it was American-based audits, and he was leveraging the fact that there are a lot of cities where there's racial segregation, and so it's very likely you ended up with natural pairs. So you'd have an Asian auditor with an Asian client firm, or African American, et cetera. And he found that when that pairing was broken in cities where there's a lot of segregation, that you actually did get sort of this positive benefit in terms of the quality of the work. And I think it's early. I think it's early days still, but it was trying to test some of the arguments out there about, and I think of it as sort of having diversity of thought, diversity of opinion when you're performing this type of task.
Boy, it blows me away, Joe. I have to admit that and. This morning I thought, well, today I'm going to be talking accounting, and I kind of had an extra cup of coffee and prepared myself for this. But this is awesome. This is incredibly interesting. It's much more than the stereotype of what you'd think accountants do. Yeah. I hope you take my comment as a compliment.
Most definitely.
A couple of weeks ago we had another in this series of sustainability conferences in the marketing area. Mm-hmm. And one of the big topics that came up in that conference was a concern over what folks like to call greenwashing, mm-hmm. right? Where companies put forward a story or a narrative about how good they are for the environment, but they're not really walking the talk. Mm-hmm. And right away when that came up, I thought, I want to circle back mm-hmm. to the greenwashing topic mm-hmm. with Joe. Because that's where you'd like it to be that the accountants can step in and correct the record or set mm-hmm. the record straight. And I don't know if this came up at the conference, but would you be willing to talk about how you accountants deal with greenwashing?
Greenwashing is challenging because the way I understand greenwashing is that the firm isn't saying anything that's factually untrue. It's really about framing. And I think that the hard part about accounting is we are looking to just see are the facts at least being presented fairly, right? Is it, is there reasonable representation of what the firm is doing and its activities when it provides this information to the various stakeholders? And so long as a firm isn't saying something factually untrue, it's hard for us to really have much of a role, much of a responsibility in that process. Where it does become interesting is that this is something where perhaps we need regulatory intervention. Mm-hmm. Because right now, organizations have a lot of latitude to discuss their operations within annual reports. Right? When managers give descriptions of performance, for example, in the managerial analysis and discussion section of the annual report, right? They're given a lot of latitude. It's like the goal is it has to be accurate, right? It has to be fair and accurate. But they spin all the time, right? They provide,
Gotcha.
It's their narrative of what happens. And so, when a company decides to label a product as being environmentally friendly, even though nothing has changed, if they're latching onto a fact that is true, like, well, the plastic is 10% recycled content, right? They haven't done anything substantive, but it's not inaccurate.
Gotcha.
And we're looking usually for inaccuracies,
Gotcha.
right? For it's a misrepresentation of what the company is doing,
I see.
its activities. So it's a really difficult challenge.
I see. What I do like about this, though, if you go back to what you were talking about in the beginning of the broadcast, when you noted that you'll have measures
Exactly.
of the actual performance,
and that's how you can try to neutralize greenwashing, right? Is a firm can come out and say we have products that are carbon light, or they're that they're recyclable, or whatever the case is. Provide the data to investors, to stakeholders, demonstrating your level of performance, right? Outlining your level of performance. Let us decide if we really think you're sustainable or not. So if we can track, for example, carbon emissions through the production cycle to the end product, then it's for us to decide, is your statement correct? Is it reasonable?
Yeah,
and how does it compare to competitors, to peers? And let's think about that on many different dimensions. If we have, if we're talking about recycled content, if we're talking about pollution, if we're talking about usage of water, right? Let's actually take a stand about, or let's force firms to take a stand from a measurement point of view. And then we're the ones who can go out and analyze. We can also go out and decide. And that's actually, this is interesting. Another paper I wanted to mention at the conference, and I apologize to the listeners for the duration here, is that we had this interesting paper by a former PhD student of mine, Sarah Malik. And she actually looked at firms' activities around the George Floyd event in terms of how did they respond to sort of the social outrage that was happening, right? This is a social event.
Yes.
And she looked at the different paths that firms had taken, and realized that some of them were greenwashing in a way, and others were like real substantive actions, and that even something as broad as the market differentiated between those two activities.
Oh, that's interesting.
Really good. Yeah, it's really heartening. Like a really good example would be a company that I really admire, Lego. Am I allowed to?
Oh,
absolutely.
Knock yourself out.
So a company that I really admire is Lego. And one of their responses to issues of social injustice and even with respect to diversity more broadly is they looked at the situation and they said, maybe we can change the product we sell. Maybe we can actually reshape our portfolio of offerings to be more inclusive. And so start bringing more individuals of color into the lineup of characters. Have it so that now the scientist is actually a female as opposed to a male, and doctors and engineers, right? That social representation is a real tangible action that I think at the end of the day will actually serve the company very well. Whereas other firms respond and they said, oh, this is really tragic. Let's donate money to an organization.
Right.
And that's,
right.
and that's also, that's very generous. That's noble too. But it's not the same kind of reaction.
Sure.
It may make them feel good. It may have, headlines in the popular press. But at the end of the day, that feels much more like greenwashing, right? It's a charitable contribution, and then you're kind of stepping away from it as opposed to doing something tangible.
Yeah, that's a good point.
And I think that's exactly what, maybe it's not what we traditionally think of accountants as, but it's like, let's make sure we gather the information about the activities that are being taken, provide it in a way that's measurable, it's objective, and then we let end users decide, was that really meaningful?
That's incredible, Joe. And when you think about it at the same time, it also means that the leaders of the world's great organizations will increasingly be paying attention to these non-market outcomes.
No, that's absolutely right. That's absolutely right. And I think that's where, maybe I'll end on this. I think when we talk about sustainability reporting, what we have to recognize is that we're in an evolutionary state at the moment. 10 years ago, 15 years ago, there was very little reporting. And what was out there was really voluntary. And over time, frameworks have come into place, organizations have been created to try to standardize the reporting process. And it's still evolutionary, and there's different paths that are being chosen by different bodies. I mean, the U.S. is taking sort of a very narrow view of sustainability reporting. It's about carbon emissions, and it's only from the lens of an investor, and it's only with respect to today, whereas European models may still have an investor framing, but it's a much broader designation of what we mean by the environment. It's more than about impacts today. It's about expected impacts in the future. It's much more about thinking about scenarios. What happens when temperatures rise 1.5 degrees, 2 degrees, 4 degrees, right? And so, that's what's being promulgated over at the International Accounting Standards Board and the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board. And then there's a worldview that says, we need to move beyond that even, and let's stop thinking about only investors. Let's think about citizens. Let's think about the employees. Let's think about our customers. Let's think about society at large. And those frameworks are getting traction to be a little more comprehensive in terms of what should be measured, what should be reported, and how do we start to hold people accountable. So I mean, I'm hopeful as well, Bill. It's going to take time, and hopefully we end up in a place that's more holistic as opposed to fragmented.
Oh, that's fantastic, Joe. Thank you so much, and thank you to all our listeners. On behalf of Professor Joe Piotroski, on behalf of Stanford University, until next time. The Stanford Initiative on Business and Environmental Sustainability podcast series is sponsored by the Stanford Graduate School of Business and the Stanford Dorr School of Sustainability. Music by Charged Particles. That's Caleb Hutzler, Mike Rock, and John Krosnick.